The Democrats win big on Tuesday. How do they do it, and what happens next? We talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program on politics and government and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Brian Mackey, State House reporter for NPR Illinois. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, good to be with you. Also
Charlie Weaver, professor at the WUIS of the Public Affairs Reporting Program. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you, Bruce. Good to be here.
The Democrats, huge victory in a lot of parts of Illinois, all statewide offices. And J.B. Pritzker, as expected, really walloped Governor Rauner. Any surprise there? Is this what we expected?
It's pretty much what the polls have been telling us for a very long time. And given the difficulty Governor Rauner had in winning his own Republican primary and the fact that he focused a lot of his campaign on just shoring up that conservative vote instead of doing what Republicans typically do in Illinois, which is trying to move to the center and appeal to a broader swath of voters. I think it is certainly not unexpected, is how I would say that. Yeah. I mean, the polls had Pritzker up anywhere from 13 to 22 points leading up to the election, and so he came in, I think, around 15 ahead, and that's pretty much fits what people were expecting.
Okay. And the Democrats gained seats in the State House. They got a veto-proof majority now. Does this mean that we're more united as a state than we were before, or just as divided as ever?
Well, I think what it means, if you look at the partisanship, the state on the legislative level is very much divided between the Chicago metro area and the rest of the state. 20 years ago, the majority of the Republicans in the General Assembly had been elected from districts in the suburbs. This year, there's only going to be a handful. The Democrats in the House have picked up 6, maybe 7 seats, depending on the outcome of when we were waiting for the provisional ballots. And they lost 1. They only picked up 1 in the downstate area, a district around Ottawa, Streeter, the Illinois River Valley there in north central Illinois. They lost a seat in deep south Illinois. And so the Democrats outside the city of Chicago and the suburbs, we have 1 here in our area, Representative Sue Scherer. There's a couple in the Metro East. There's 1 in the Quad Cities, 1 in Peoria. Other than that, they're all from suburban and city districts. I'm guessing probably more from suburban than city districts now. And so that's a huge shift in the partisan makeup. I think part of it is downstate Democrats and Republicans are very socially conservative. And the Democrats historically were folks who were blue-collar, union workers, manufacturing plants, coal mines, that sort of thing. Much of that industry and mining has disappeared, and with it, those blue-collar workers in those jobs that were unionized. You have union workers who work for the state, of course, but the whole downstate area is kind of contracting in terms of its political strength based on numbers. And so, yeah, the Democrats in the House are going to have the largest majority percentage-wise that they've had since 1965. So that's a pretty long time.
Yeah. You know, interesting point. I mean, the suburbs are becoming more democratic. Yeah, here.
I mean, J.B. Pritzker won DuPage County. This is not. I think this is something that 10, 20 years ago would have been unthinkable.
Well, yeah, but so was a governor who couldn't get a budget passed. I mean, how much of this is J.B. Pritzker? I mean, infamously, Mike Madigan 4 years ago kind of poo-pooed the victory of Bruce Rauner, saying who couldn't beat Pat Quinn. 4 years later, so what? Who couldn't beat Bruce Rauner? So I'm wondering, you know, we have both Bruce Rauner, hugely unpopular in Illinois. You also have Donald Trump, and you know, how much were there any Trump coattails here that might explain at least part of this?
Yes, and I think it cuts both ways. So in the suburbs, I think the Trump effect probably hurt state legislative candidates, and we certainly saw 2 of the congressional seats that were held by Republicans there who flipped to Democrats.
Yeah.
In southern Illinois, it might have cut the other way, where you had, as Charlie said, there was the last Democrat in deep southern Illinois, Natalie Phelps Finney, who was a relation to a former congressman from that area, and more recently a state rep. She was actually taking the seat that I believe one of her cousins had held, state representative, former state rep Brandon Phelps. And that area has now really trended towards Trump. We saw Congressman Mike Bost able to fend off a challenge, a very well-funded challenge from a Democrat named Brendan Kelly, who's the St. Clair County State's Attorney.
And he's had high hopes for him.
They did have high hopes for that district, and President Trump came to that district twice in the past few months, including just a week or 2 before the election. So that's, we've seen the Trump effect both helping Republicans downstate and probably being more of a liability for them in the suburbs of Chicago.
Well, what are we to make then of the 13th congressional district here closer to home? That was a pretty close race in terms of how the other races played out. In fact, CNN infamously said that, called the race for Betsy Sue Londrigan, or excuse me, Betsy Dirksen Londrigan,
yeah.
my mistake, well before they should have, given that that's not what happened. What do we make of that? I mean, Rodney Davis clearly chained himself pretty much to Trump, and voters were faced with a real stark choice, I think, between the 2 candidates.
I thought Davis actually tried to walk a line that, he did go to a Trump rally. Trump did not come to his district, but he was,
Pence was here.
Yep, Vice President Pence was here. He was thanked by name by President Trump at the rally for the steel workers in Granite City. On the other hand, he made a point of letting the media know that he was in attendance when President Obama gave that big speech at the University of Illinois. And so he's somebody who has prided himself on being a bipartisan, work across the aisle kind of guy, even though he does frequently vote with what the Republicans are doing.
He voted for the Obama budget, I believe, in 2015 that Obama called a Christmas present for the United States people.
Sure.
He did.
But he's somebody who has tried to walk that line of not being too far one way or the other, and the district was, however, drawn to be competitive. So it's another one where Democrats had high hopes, but ultimately, and his first election, I think, was 0.3 percentage point.
He won by 1,000 votes.
1,000 votes, yeah.
And a fairly progressive independent got 7% of the vote. So you could make the argument that, but for that third candidate.
Sure, but he has not had difficulty or really a strong challenge again until this year.
That's true. Yeah.
And he pulled it out in the end.
Yeah. Did the D's make any kind of an error or mistake if they had to do it all over again? Obama was a bit late joining the Londrigan wagon, I guess, so to speak. The former president's endorsement was late coming in, I think, compared to other candidates. Should the D's have gotten onto Londrigan faster than they did? Did they miss an opportunity here, perhaps?
I don't necessarily think that they did. To me, what's really important is you get the vote out. It's one thing to have a charismatic leader like President Obama or like Donald Trump, and you might say he has negative charisma, but he still energizes people.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And it's something else to make sure you get them to the polls, make sure you get them to vote. Democrats had a tremendous, what in the old days would be called absentee ballot effort. Now it's vote by mail.
Right.
And that helped, I think, generate a lot of the support for the Democrats, and they also got a lot of people to the polls. Mm-hmm. Now, it was excitement about voting for candidates, whether it be Trump downstate or whether it be, in the case of our area, the 13th district at the University of Illinois, it was students who were energized, and I would guess that they probably voted for Londrigan because I think she carried Champaign County pretty heavily.
Right.
Yeah. Lost in Sangamon, not by a whole lot.
Not by a lot.
And then in the rural counties in between, that's where Rodney Davis actually won.
Right.
But the effort to get young voters to the poll, and it's mostly Democrats who are making that effort, really paid off.
Yeah. I mean, there was that infamous picture that came out just on the early voting the day on Monday before election that showed, and election day itself, of the student union building over it, just hundreds of apparently of students in line going down the stairwell. I think that got a lot of folks maybe convinced that, geez, maybe she does have a chance here.
Yeah, and there were some Democrats from that area who were alleging that this was a attempt to suppress the student vote, the Democratic vote, and in fact, the county clerk, who was the election administrator there, I believe was running for one of those statewide countywide offices in Champaign that the Democrats ended up sweeping.
Which they were supposed to do, but.
Yeah, no, they weren't. I think that turnout, I mean, what we're talking about is turnout. Champaign was a notable example where it was up, but it was really kind of tremendously higher all over the state. The numbers are still very preliminary for this year, but looking at the results, Bruce Rauner only got 100,000 fewer votes than he did in 2014, but Pritzker got 700,000 more votes than Quinn did. So Rauner didn't underperform what he did 4 years ago all that much, but
he kind of out-Quinned Quinn, maybe?
Yeah, well, Pritzker vastly outperformed what Governor Quinn had done.
Well, I'm guessing the total vote is going to be a lot higher, too.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Well, I mean, now that Pritzker has got, the office, what does he do with it? I mean, how many times, how many days has he spent in elective office in his life? None?
Zero.
Zero. How many government jobs?
Just like Governor Rauner.
Just like Governor Rauner.
Although he's wanted it for a lot longer, and I was talking to Jim Edgar, former Governor Jim Edgar, about this very thing, because there is this phenomena now of these super rich neophytes. That's another friend of the show, Chris Mooney, political scientist at the University of Illinois at Chicago, has identified about 15 of these people across the country who are super wealthy, and being governor is either their first, or in some cases they were maybe Secretary of State before becoming governor. But this is a definite phenomena. About a quarter of American governors have been these ultra wealthy people with no political experience.
And you also have the Jesse Venturas and the Arnold Schwarzeneggers of the world.
Celebrities, right. Donald Trump's.
There you go, too.
In the old days, the super rich were content with buying a Major League Baseball team or a
now they want the White House or the governor's mansion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so what Governor Edgar said, though, is that, he is, we should add, since the election, he has been put on Pritzker's transition committee. So and he refused to endorse one side or the other, but it was pretty obvious by his not endorsing Governor Rauner, who he had endorsed 4 years ago, and based on many statements he's made over the last 4 years, that there was no love lost.
Kind of like Jeannie Ives, I'm not endorsing him, but I'm voting for him, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, Edgar wouldn't even say that. He said it's a secret ballot.
Fair point.
So when I asked him about who he was voting for. But he says, experience is important, and he says, that former Governor Thompson used to have this line. He would say that, the day you're most prepared to be governor is your last day in office, because it's a job you just have to learn on the job for. But he did say, as long as you bring the right people in around you and you listen to your advisors. And I think that's something where Governor Rauner there were people that he brought in to his administration that a lot of Springfield regulars thought, okay, yeah, that's a good person.
Sure,
his budget director had a long career being a Senate budget analyst. But what we've heard out of the Rauner administration is that he often did not listen to his advisors. When he was pushing his agenda, he wanted to do everything. He wanted to work quickly and break a lot of China, and sort of as he was pushing through, and that approach seems to have, obviously it backfired. It didn't work out for him.
He infamously fired some of the folks got rid of some of the folks that were respected in Springfield, replaced them with Illinois Policy Institute folks, and that just blew up in his face.
Right, and that is around the time, and it's also the time when the budget impasse ended despite his veto, but that's where his popularity dives by about 10 percentage points and never really gets much above 30% again.
So if you're a J.B. Pritzker, what's first on the agenda? I mean, one thing that I think that he's already said, on the campaign trail, he said, he said, I'm in favor of a progressive or graduated income tax. He's, what do you mean exactly by that? I'm in favor of a fair tax. Well, show me the politicians that I favor an unfair tax. But anywho, I guess the devil's going to be in the details. But one thing that he did say on the campaign trail is he had suggested there was a way to move toward that, absent the required constitutional amendment with, I don't want to call them gimmicks, but various sorts of exemptions that could create a de facto graduated income tax. Since the election, he said that's not on his agenda. Why would he say something like that? Why would he say what he would say?
Why? Now? You're asking me to psychoanalyze him or something. Please. I don't know why he would say it. I know he said it though. Coming into office and promising a tax changes right away. I think he wants to see where his transition lands and you know, get some advice from people and settle into the job before he starts making any policy pronouncements. He has talked about, I mean, there's some fairly unambiguous statements from the campaign about pushing for the graduated income tax sooner than later. And so that is something I think if he does plan to follow through on what he said during the campaign, he will have to propose fairly early on.
But as a practical matter, the earliest you could actually have a graduated income tax, I guess, theoretically, would be the day after the 2020 vote is certified, officially recognizes this is the official vote. If there were a proposed constitutional amendment approved by 60% of the people who vote on amendment, or a majority of the people voting in the election, you could have a bill written and signed into law that says if the voters approve allowing a graduated income tax, this law will take effect. And here's the graduated income tax, here's the levels, here's the rates, here are the exemption and deductions. You could have it all ready to go that, as I say, when the certification occurs, and this year I believe it's November 20th, and the results are official, then it could kick in. But in reality, nobody is going to put together a bill with that degree of specificity before the election.
Nobody wants folks to really know what they're voting for.
That's one way to look at
yeah.
it. But,
I mean,
another way, a practical way, is let's wait and see if voters approve it, and then let's sit down and negotiate the terms.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is, what folks really want to know is, well, what's it going to mean in my household, in my pocketbook? And what you're describing, I think, is exactly right. They're not going to give that level of specificity. Here are each of the income brackets.
And the reason is, whoever the opponent is going to take and run with it.
Right.
Governor Rauner said flat out, with a graduated income tax, everybody pays more. The middle class, every state that has one, the middle class is hurt. That's a flat out lie.
Correct. I mean,
either through misinformation or through his conscience decision to misrepresent. He was given a pants on fire by the Better Government Association.
That's true.
Fact checkers for that. So that's the kind of thing. You don't want to give ammunition. If this were like a reasoned academic debate, you and I discussing the merits, and Brian, well, what about this level with these exemptions? Is that better than this level with these other exemptions? That's one thing. But to put it out there where social media will jump on it, people will distort it. I can see why people don't want to be specific.
No, I can see that too, but I mean, it's going to continue. Pritzker was asked about that at almost every point, every media availability he had during the campaign, he was asked about it, and I think that's going to probably continue.
Oh, sure.
And you are also going to have other groups out there, think tanks and groups like that, they're going to rush to fill in the vacuum and put the scariest scenario out there, or if if that's their political leaning, or maybe they'll put a more favorable scenario out there if that's their political view. And hopefully there will be seems like a media organization, with computers you can do a fairly simple modeling and say, okay, if we set the rates here for people making less than 30,000, 50,000, you can sort of game out what these rates would be. So I think there's a chance that, hopefully people can have some grasp of what they're voting for, but I think Charlie's right as well, that we aren't really going to see the specifics of this hammered out before the election.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right.
We'll find out.
Well, before the 2016 election, in that legislative session, Representative Lou Lang, who is a Democrat from Skokie, had a plan, and it was contingent upon there being a constitutional amendment adopted. And under the levels and rates that he set out, his calculation was that something like 90% of the people would pay less.
Yeah. No, and I think that's probably important to sell it, is that you can show that what Rauner said isn't true. I mean, you can design a tax system and do just about anything you want it to do, and so again, the devil's in the details. But you're right. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's taxes go up. It can mean exactly what Pritzker wants it to mean, which is only the wealthy pay more.
And in Rauner's case, what he said was that everywhere else that has this, this occurs. All you got to do is look at the data from everywhere else.
Sure. Yeah.
As an exercise, I pretended that I was a taxpayer in all our neighboring states and figured out how much I would pay under their system of levels of taxation and what the rates would be and the deductions and exemptions. And it turned out that in Wisconsin, I would have saved money. In Missouri, I would have saved money. Iowa, I would have paid more. So it depends on the details.
Sure.
before you know how it's going to affect you.
Right. But I mean, as you point out, we're 3 years out, assuming that everything moves as quickly as it can in terms of putting something on the ballot, it passes, then they've got to come back and actually design the tax code itself. We're 3 years or so out from that becoming reality. And meanwhile, Pritzker has promised big. He's talked about such stuff as expanding preschool to all 3 and 4-year-olds. A very good idea, but how do you pay for it? Allowing folks to buy into Medicaid, a very good idea. Hopefully, won't cost any more. I mean, there's some folks that say that it won't. But how do you govern for the next 2-3 years until you get this graduated income tax in place, if in fact you can get in place and deliver on these promises to expand some of these social services?
Well, I think it'd be unrealistic to expect he's going to do all of this in his first 6 months.
Yeah.
As a practical matter, that's the deadline for getting a budget for fiscal 2020 enacted. So you want to do what you're going to do in the first 6 months. Some of it is going to be long term. We revised the way we fund elementary and secondary education, where 99% of the new money goes to the school districts with the most need, where the gap between what you need to educate kids and what they can raise locally is the greatest. For us to get everybody up where they have enough money to meet what it costs to educate their kids, it's going to take what the calculation is, like 15, 16 years, doing it in increments each year. So some of this stuff can't be done all at once.
Sure.
You have to phase it in.
Well, one thing that could be done maybe sooner rather than later is marijuana and gambling, both of which the governor-elect says he's in favor of. He's in favor of, suggested strongly he's in favor of legalizing marijuana. He's also suggested gambling expansion to include sports gambling. I'm not sure if we know authoritatively where he might be on a casino for Chicago, but how likely are those two things to happen?
I mean, if the governor gets behind it, that would be significant, but gambling is one of those things that, the stars have to align with the moon and the ocean tides and everything else for anything like that to change in Illinois, because you have so many interests with a lot of money at stake in those things. And right now in Illinois, you have obviously the major casino operators, 10 of those, I think, casino licenses. You still have horse race tracks, although that's been an industry in decline for a long time. And now with the video gambling operators, there was a recent report out of the legislative fiscal group that said that there are enough video terminals in Illinois that it's the equivalent of 24 additional casinos. They're just spread in all the truck stops and restaurants all over the state. So, I mean, that is a lot of money. That industry, I've talked to people on the inside there, they think that there could be some sort of a shaking out. It's probably a little oversaturated right now. And so even if you do expand gambling, how much money are you going to get from it? Has Illinois hit a saturation point with the gambling?
Well, as a matter of fact, the Commission on Government and Forecasting Accountability, in its annual update on wagering in Illinois, suggested that in terms of recurring revenues, you're talking about maybe $20 million, $30 million a year if you go through with the plans that have been on the table thus far. On the other hand, there will be a huge one-time hit. If you license a casino in Chicago, the licensing fee or the initial getting the license to operate, you could bring in a lot of money one time, but after you pay, say, $500,000 for your license, then the state's take of your gambling, what would you say, the gate, so to speak, the money that you bring in, isn't going to be anywhere in that neighborhood.
Well, let's talk about marijuana here for a second, too. I mean, J.B. Pritzker did come out fairly soon in the campaign, and he's reiterated that again since the election, I believe, saying this is one solution to help mitigate the state's fiscal woes. I don't suspect that he believes that it can solve everything. How much of the priority do you think that can be? Because so far, at least, the medical marijuana program has been doing better, is not entirely as healthy, I think, as some folks expected that it might be in terms of, because there's been restrictions on it. Is this something that was just campaign talk? What's the mood of the legislature? Is this something that now that we got a veto proof, this could go forward?
Well, there's been a lot of change in the legislature, but I wouldn't assume that it would be able to go forward. I mean, there's one thing that is true about one of the reasons that Democrats have big numbers in the legislature is because they are a big tent party in Illinois, and people are allowed to vote their districts. And so if you have legislators winning in, there are a number of them who have won seats from Republicans, I think 6 in the House so far, possibly more this time around. Excuse me, that may be counting the Senate too, but
No,
Anyway.
there was 6 House pickups from the suburbs.
Okay. But so, I mean, these are Republican districts, and these legislators are going to be vulnerable in the next election. You always are in your first election after winning, and they're going to be watching their districts. And if, you know, the voters aren't ready to move to this place, then they're not, I mean, these are not just going to come to Springfield and suddenly be willing to vote for any liberal Democratic agenda item that's out there. I mean, they're going to be voting their districts. And so I'm not sure that, you know, there will be, just because there's a veto-proof majority, that certainly doesn't guarantee that these things will pass.
But on the other hand, the size of the majority is such that you do have maybe half a dozen, even 10 of your lawmakers who are in shaky districts. You tell them to vote no. You only need 60.
Yeah, and you don't, especially if you don't have to override a governor who's on board with the plan.
So
you know, part of me is so used to for the last 4 years thinking if you need 71.
No,
you're right.
For sure, you're going to have 73. It's quite likely when all the mail-in ballots are tabulated, you're going to have at least 74 members, Democratic members in the House. You only need 60. So your 14 most shaky people, you let them vote no.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, that's the way you do a roll call.
We're nearly out of time, but it occurs to me, is it worth asking the question, does Pritzker now have a mandate, or does Madigan have a mandate, or is mandate just a word we shouldn't be using these days?
Yeah, I don't think people actually get mandates anymore.
Okay.
If anything, the mandate is to try and work cooperatively. I think one of the reasons that Bruce Rauner was rejected was because of his style.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the fact he couldn't be trusted to tell the truth. So those two things aren't very good. I mean, we can have less than honest politicians, but one that has a bad style, that's not a good combination. What do you think, Brian? Do we have a mandate on anything?
I think that the Speaker thinks we have a mandate on ending the Republican strategy of trying to tie everyone to Mike Madigan as being the best strategy. He put out a very unusual 4-page memo with screenshots from ads basically saying that, look, the Republicans tried it, it failed, it felt... Hannah Meisel, who's been on the show, said it felt like a 4-page memo that encapsulated 4 years of angst or pent-up anger about this thing. But, you know, so I think that he's ready to move on.
Okay.
From that.
And with that, we have to move on. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.